es nuestro Data Protection Officer. Como para ponerlo en palabras fáciles, es el que sabe en detalle todas las regulaciones y leyes que hay en lo que respecta a protección de datos y privacidad, que es un tema sobre el que nos preguntan muchísimo, sobre todo en mercados como Brasil o Colombia también. Bueno, en Argentina también. La verdad es que en toda Latinoamérica nos preguntan muchísimo y por eso trajimos a uno de los expertos para que pueda darles un poco de claridad sobre todas estas temáticas. Hi Vincent. Hola Vincent.
Hel- Hello, ¿cómo estás?
Muy bien. Vincent además habla como 5 idiomas, así que ya lo van a ver. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Hasta luego.
Ok, voy a hacer la presentación en inglés, si está bien para todos, y ya empiezo. El futuro de la privacidad, ¿qué podemos esperar en América Latina? So, switching in English. So, Latin America is pretty big. And so, what we decided to do is jump in a balloon and go up and up so that we can have an overall view. So, but after a while, we need to study the detail of a legislation. So, it all started back in January 2020. And this is when we got the first Chrome announcement, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, explained that third party cookies would be deprecated by 2021. And then it didn't happen. Why? Because there was another announcement on 23rd of June 2021, so very recently, just before the summer, as we all know, that the third party cookies would not be deprecated until 2023. So, of course, for the typical ad tech guy, it's a bit confusing, what's going on and what shall I do? Yes, we got another 18 months before the so called cookie Armageddon really happens. So, first, we need to understand the timeline, okay? And we'll explain, the links, of course, between what's going on with Google, what's going on with Facebook and Safari and Apple, etc. But basically, it all started a while ago with Apple, which has been really basically leading the way in terms of imposing privacy restrictions on what was going on. Then Firefox, as we know, and then, as I just explained, in January 2020, it was announced that by 2022, the third-party cookies would be deprecated. So the official explanations, you could look at them, of course, in the papers and in the in online, explaining that basically the current flock tests are on GDPR compliant, that flock's not working, the privacy sandbox, they want to get everyone involved, etc., etc. The reality is, and it does make sense, when you're Chrome and you have such a huge market share of the browser market, and if you Google, and of course you've got stakes everywhere in the digital technology, and especially in advertising technology, you want to make sure that whatever move you're going to make is not going to create a major disruption and turbulence for the market. So I think wisely they estimated that the market would not be ready by 2022. Remember, the second announcement was only 3 months ago, and we're just a few months away from 2022. And they decided that by having 18 months more, the market would slowly adapt. Replacements or solutions in order to really make up for the lost volume of third party cookies would exist in the market. And a lot of companies would be really working on new products, whether they're contextual, whether they're now, yes. Now, the reality is we can look at the history with Apple, Firefox, Chrome, and look at it independently and say, okay, it's basically browser wars. Apple and Google are fighting with each other. That has an impact on privacy and therefore on the availability of data. But that's absolutely incorrect. What really started all this is very simple. It's a data protection legislation which was passed on the 26th of April 2016 and was implemented or came into force on the 25th of May 2018, so a little bit over 3 years now, and it's a GDPR. The GDPR, of course, has all kinds of ramifications, and we're going to talk about them. But one of the most important ramifications, and which was probably not so much expected back 3 years ago, is the influence that the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, the most ambitious data protection regulation in the world, which, as you know, covers the 31 countries of the EU plus the UK, which is not in the EU anymore, um, it's the influence it had on so many different geographies. So when you look at the areas in orange, so this is the EU, of course, and a few countries which are not part of the EU but part of the EEA and which are under GDPR legislation. And this is the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom has the GDPR, except it's called UK GDPR. It's exactly the same thing. But anyway, it's now, as I say, not part of the EU. So all these areas in orange are the ones where there is ambitious data protection legislation which has been passed, which is already in force, or which is about to be passed. So as you can see, you've got very, very different areas such as Canada, Thailand passed a very similar legislation to GDPR about a year ago or a little bit over that. Japan has made major changes. Australia is about to, Canada too. And as you can see, the United States is a little bit unique because nothing has been done from a federal point of view, but many states have passed unique legislations, the most ambitious of which is California, which passed in June 2018 the CCPA, and on 3rd of November 2020, the CPRA, which is going to complement the CCPA, but just for the state of California. Of course, when you work in Latin America, because of all the pages which are consumed in Spanish in the United States, being aware of the state legislations in the United States is obviously critical. Okay, but we're not talking about the United States specifically in this presentation. If you look at the map, one of the areas where a lot has happened, but still much more is bound to happen is obviously Latin America. Now, the thing we need to understand is the impact of a data protection legislation, whether it's GDPR or whether it's slightly less ambitious legislation such as the CCPA in California, is multifaceted. Again, to summarize, there is one of the facets, and the first facet is obviously the redefinition of what personal data means, and we'll talk about that. Then very often you've got something called data protection principles, which are sometimes not binary, meaning it's directionally what the legislator expects the publisher or the data aggregator or whoever is a controller, what they expect them to do. So it can be transparency, it can be storage limitation, it can be accountability. There are numerous data protection principles. Then it represents a lot of work on contracts, because when you've got a data protection legislation, you need to make sure that in addition to your MSA, you've got specific contracts which are going to take care specifically of the data protection part and everything to do with the data flow. Security standards are more and more important, and ad tech, because for years we've been dealing with cookies, and of course if you steal a billion cookies, the impact or the risk for those parties whose cookies have been stolen, the users, is obviously much more limited than credit card details or dates of birth or family names, things like that. Still, because data protection legislation has been changing so much recently, the constraints on ad tech companies have grown a lot. And in the past, it was just, let's say, standard kind of security standards, and now more and more, many big companies in Europe or in the United States are asking for basically ISO 27001 or 27017, etc., etc. It's a change also in the legal basis. Now, in order to collect personal data, you need what is called a legal basis. I'm sure you've all heard about consent versus legitimate interests, which is a big conversation in AdTech ever since GDPR was passed 3 years ago. But we're having the same conversation, for example, in Brazil right now, and I'll talk about Brazil in a second. Then it's data subject rights. Again, across most modern data protection legislations, users can reach out to any ad tech company, data aggregators, publishers, even advertisers, and say, tell me what you have about me, or please delete everything you have about me, or please go back 12 months on all the information you have about me. And they could very well just send you a cookie ID and a proof of their identity so that you don't pass that information to someone who is not the person they claim to be. Finally, the best and the easiest way to deal with data protection legislation challenges is obviously what is called a compliance roadmap. And again, we don't have the time in this presentation, but if you're interested, it's obviously something that we could give you some non-legal but friendly advice about. Now, I mean, some people may disagree, but I think Latin America has been really, really influenced by GDPR, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it. You've got Europe is obviously a patchwork of cultures, histories, and languages, of course, and there is, as we all know, there is a lot of Portuguese, Portuguese from Portugal traffic into Brazilian sites, and vice versa, and same thing in Spanish between Spain and all the countries in Latin America except for Brazil and Belize, of course. So because of that, GDPR in reality should be a challenge and a topic for anyone operating in Latin America. Then you add to that other data protection legislations, and I know I mentioned that before, such as CCPA, because if you've got basically Californian residents logging in sites and pages, whether it's Colombian or in Argentina or wherever, then those publishers have to consider CCPA. Just a quick reminder, about all kinds of legislations which have been passed in the recent past. And my point here is this is just a beginning. All those countries, whether, from the top to the bottom, whether you're talking about Mexico or Chile or Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, Ecuador or Peru, all those countries have passed different legislations with different constraints. And my experience has been that sometimes the countries and the big companies operating in those countries are very aware of the application to ad tech of those legislations, and sometimes they're less aware. As soon as many, those legislations are going to be updated and brought a little bit closer to, say, something like the LGPD, which itself is very close to GDPR, things are going to change immensely across Latin America. And there are many reasons to this, okay? So obviously I'm not going to capture everything and be exhaustive for the time we have here, but one of the key reasons is adequacy. Of course, the other reason is Basically, everyone's trying to build a modern economy. Everyone is trying to jump into the global data economy, which everyone realizes is more and more important. But adequacy is very important. And adequacy means that because of language, in part, and also because of the holistic and international nature of the internet, therefore of data flows, data goes, travels at light speed constantly. And the EU, which is a pretty important economic bloc, doesn't see it that way. The EU doesn't want EU data to be collected left, right, and center outside of the EU. And therefore, they've got a concept which is called adequacy, which is they will distinguish between EU countries, adequacy countries, and third countries. So, what does it mean? It means if you want to transfer data from anywhere within the EU to anywhere in the EU, as long as you obey the law and you follow GDPR, from a transfer point of view, it's a non-issue. You can send EU data or French data to Germany and vice versa without any restriction. Okay, that's the notion of the EU. Then you've got a list of countries which are called adequacy countries, with which the EU has been negotiating for a long time, and those countries would actually the EU would deem that their data protection frameworks are good enough and that basically EU data is protected enough that the data can be transferred under the adequacy system. And then you've got something called third countries, which is basically most countries in the world, because there are something like 10 to 12 adequacy countries, where you need what is called a transfer mechanism in order to send the data from the EU to those countries. So I'll come to that. And the problem is, and sorry, we missed the line here. I just realized, but I'm sure you can follow me. Is that it's become even more complicated in Europe recently. Without going into the detail of all of this, basically, in the past few months, one of the biggest things which have changed in the EU, building on what the GDPR is they've changed the transfer mechanisms. So now, theoretically, to send data from Spain to Mexico or to Colombia, it's not obvious at all. If I tell you all the things which have to be done from a contractual point of view, you would be maybe not surprised, but maybe very surprised. Now, here it is. The line is finished now. Great. Now, as you can see in my previous slide, I keep talking about SCCs. Okay. So we'll make a little break here, and I'll just try to explain what SCCs are. So SCCs means standard contractual clauses, and they are the primary transfer mechanism for EU data to a third country. So basically, let's take an example. I'm a publisher. So I'm a publisher in Mexico City, and I've got basically 5% of my traffic coming from Spain, for example. In theory, I should, or I receive, even simpler example, I receive data from a Spanish provider of basically data, and he's sending that data to me. Or I'm doing business with that Spanish provider, and there is a data exchange between Spain and Mexico. That's an easier example. Then what will need to happen is there will be a need for an MSA. Then there will be a need on top of the MSA for something called a DPA, which is a data processing agreement, which is, to put it simply, is just an addendum to the MSA or to the contract, which speaks specifically about data protection. Okay. And then in addition to the DPA, you will need annexes, so that's part 3, which explain in detail the processing, meaning what you do with the data between the two companies, so the Mexican company and the Spanish company. And number 4, this is where the SCCs comes in to play. You will need something which is statutory and which is basically a long list of clauses which will have to be respected, mostly by the Spanish party if they send Spanish data to Mexico, but also by the Mexican party. And the Spanish party will be called the data exporter, and the Mexican party will be called the data importer. It's a bit harder to give an example when it's very standard and high level, but obviously it works better with specific use cases. So that's it for this explanation. So there remain challenges, we think, in data protection in LATAM. Okay, we saw that with Brazil. There is sometimes a complex legislative patchwork. I mean, sometimes you've got, obviously in Latin America, you've got obviously different legislative frameworks. For example, Brazil and Mexico are federal countries, so you've got federal laws, state laws, and that makes it complex. You've got also a data culture which can be different between private and public sectors. You've got data security standards which can vary a lot based on the size of the company. Big Brazilian, Argentine, Colombian, or Mexican multinationals will have different security standards than much smaller companies. Data transfers, we spoke a lot about that. And then you've got behaviors also. Very large corporates will tend to look at the legal implications of data transfers and application of data legislations, data protection legislations, in a very different way from much smaller companies. Now, let's go into LGPD, which is obviously a very interesting example because this is the first data protection legislation which has been very much inspired from GDPR to be implemented in Latin America. And it started with Brazil, which, by the way, at the time had a real patchwork of data protection laws between different states, between different departments, etc. And LGPD is obviously bringing all of this together at the scale of a country. So it's in Portuguese, obviously, the Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados Pessoais, implemented, as I said before, so passed on 14th of August 2018, but implemented on 18th of September 2020. It's been replacing or supplementing more than 40 legal norms, what I was saying about the patchwork. And the aim has been to make the country much more competitive in an increasingly data-driven world economy. And that is totally correct. But as I said, this is where, Europe has been playing a huge role. Usually in advertising technology, the center of the world has been the United States, but the privacy wave has totally started in Europe. And obviously that's interesting. And the industry, so the ANPD is basically the national regulator which has been created for the LGPD. And the industry in Brazil has been waiting with a lot of anticipation for what is called a guidance. So usually, again, that's totally modeled after the GDPR. And by the way, the CPRA, which is the second California data protection legislation, is going also to take much more inspiration from the GDPR than the first, which was California data protection legislation, which was the CCPA. And both LGPD and CPRA are going to have created for LGPD, because LGPD, as I said, has come into force, or CPRA in 2023, they are creating a national regulator. So basically, it's not the Ministry of Justice or the Secretary of Justice or Department of Justice in California, which is looking at that. It is a regulator which is supposed to be independent, but most of the members are obviously appointed by the government. And basically, they're going to create the rules. But they're not going to create law, they're going to create guidances, which is going to help the stakeholders and the actors to implement or to apply the law to their industry as well as possible. Okay. Now, very quickly, LGPD has all the hallmarks of GDPR. We spoke about that. Personal data definition is extremely similar. Same principle of legal basis. Same principles of data protection principles. They have the concept of personal sensitive data, of data subject rights, of controller and processor, international transfers. They've got something called data breach notification. They've got something called the DPO, Data Protection Officer, or encargado. Again, this is coming from the GDPR. California doesn't have that yet. And it's a notion that someone in the company is in charge of basically interacting with the users, influencing and advising the management on what they need to do from a privacy and data protection point of view, and liaising with the national regulator. Then there is a concept of penalties, and there are obviously a lot of contractual, arrangements which have to be done. Now, what have we learned with LGPD? And by the way, coming back to this slide, when you look at this, what I would say is you see the future. Yeah, this is really a view on the future in the rest of Latin America. Because I don't have a crystal ball, what I can't tell you is at which speed it will happen in each of the Latin American countries. This is something I would be unable to say. But is that a view of the future? I've got no doubt about it. The learnings after 9 months, so that I don't know whether it's a view of the future, but it's an interesting indication of the future because we've got one country, again, which has implemented a GDPR-like legislation. Things have not been moving very fast, okay? The change, which has been quite nearly immediate, has been contractual relations, in the sense that big corporates in Brazil immediately have jumped on LGPD and have basically, engage in a lot of discussions with other companies, partners, processors, suppliers, and at them, to sign and negotiate a lot of contracts, or rather DPAs or data processing agreements, which, as I explained, are addenda to the main contracts or the MSAs. After about a year, actually a little bit over a year, 13 months, the industry still is waiting and still is not very clear on what is going to be the guidance from the ANPD, the national regulator, with regards to the legal base. What does it mean? What the industry doesn't know is whether they can basically collect data and say, it's my legitimate interest and I'm fine as long as I go about everything else under LGPD, I'm okay. Or do I need to do the same that what has happened in Europe for the last 3 years, which is for digital advertising or the advertising technology, if I collect a cookie ID or device ID or something like that, I need the consent from the user. And that's obviously fundamental for our industry. The courts have put some level of pressure whilst they were waiting for the ANPD to issue guidance. SARs, subject access requests, that's what it means. Basically, it's when users contact the company and say, hey, give me my data, delete my data, tell me what you're doing with my data. And that's an obligation of transparency that all data protection legislations have. That we've seen very little going on in Brazil. And the last thing we've seen is very diverse company behaviors with, very big, and I don't want to generalize because it's awful to generalize. Of course, there are small companies in Brazil which have been crazy good about, complying with the legislation, and there are big companies which have not. But in general, what we have seen is big corporates have been really, really focused on LGPD, and much smaller companies have been less focused on LGPD. Very quickly, I think we've got something like another 5 minutes. Obviously, and what we found out is even there was another bite of the cherry, as you say, as we say in English. The reality is the cookies life, or the third-party cookies life, has been extended a little bit, but that's just the aim is to prepare the cookie for the unavoidable. So just again, to summarize, I think you've all understood that the data protection legislation has changed everything for ad tech. And if you had to really boil it down to something super simple, for 20 years or 25, based on how old you think the industry is, the cookie was called anonymous. Basically, you could do whatever you wanted with it, let's be honest. And GDPR and what has come after that, which is all the legislations and LGPD, but also the Chrome announcement and what Safari has done, what Firefox has done, all of that, as I explained before, is coming from the GDPR. It's simply we now have to consider cookies as personal data. And all the obligations that we have on names and what used to be called in our industry PII, which by the way is an American term, it now applies to personal data, and cookies, device IDs, IP addresses are personal data. Why? And this definition is the GDPR's definition, but you see it's exactly the same definition under LGPD, because personal data is now any information relating to an identified or identifiable. And this is obviously very, very different, in ad tech, moving from personally identifiable information, which is PII, to personal data. Basically, as long as there is a way that you could link the cookie ID and the user, and that's obviously the purpose of the digital advertising industry, to be able to track the user in order to serve relevant ads, then it's considered personal data. So suddenly in 2018, what was outside of the scope of data protection went under the scope of data protection. And then, if we had one image to remember, actually, I should have done this image a little bit better. And we should have the first domino being the GDPR domino. Then you could imagine the GDPR domino falling and then taking everything with it. It's changing everything. And the ad tech industry is never going to be the same. The key impacts, obviously, there will be pressure on the duopoly. By that, I mean Google and Facebook. There will be industry frameworks. Don't forget your privacy policies. The first thing which counts is really to do a great privacy policy on a site, publish a site or whatever. Contract work is going to be very important. So you need to be well armed with the right legal advice. Security standards are going to be essential. If there is one thing the European authorities absolutely cannot stand, what drives them crazy is data breaches. Obviously, they put much bigger fines to super big companies than to, mid-sized ad tech companies. But, when British Airways loses emails or credit card details, or when it's Hilton or whatever, they go nuts in Europe and they put very large fines. So security standards are going to be essential. And then the indirect impact, we spoke about it quite a lot. Chrome, iOS 14, the third-party cookies, the rise of tokenization, the rise of single sign-on, which is talked about a lot. The most likely outcomes, this is obviously, again, this is not crystal ball gazing, but, we can expect CTV and video growth, which will be much less impacted by the deprecation of third-party cookies. There will be a lot of work done on first-party data. There is a bright future for exploitation of first-party data. There is also a bright future for universal IDs. It is possible that the so-called authenticated audiences might disappoint. There will be more money going into contextual. I still don't believe that contextual will suddenly take the biggest chunk of the money, because we've got 20 years of user level targeting behind us. I think cohort-based advertising is going to appear. I think it's very possible that in the future there will be targeting, not necessarily at user level, but at what I call mini segment level, which is segments of 5, 10, 20 users, which may be as efficient, we don't know yet, as the traditional user level targeting. Of course, non-digital operators who actually are digital, but who are not coming from the digital world, such as telcos, retailers, etc. They're going to have a big role to play because they've got so much data. And if we can do matching between those data sets and the data sets and all the IDs of the ad tech industry, basically this is going to be one of the big avenues to move forward with obviously much less volume with the deprecation of third-party cookies. And I also think that there will be much more of a mix between deterministic and probabilistic, and that a lot of tracking will become probabilistic again. Anyway, this is very vague. These are just directions because at the end of the day, no one knows the future, especially in our industry where it changes every day. And then what do we have to expect, in the future? So the big question is, will there be a US federal law? Of course, if there is one, it's going to change a lot. It's impossible to predict. What is certain is the big states are all passing data protection legislation, especially the ones where most of that tech is concentrated, which usually tend to be the blue states where data protection legislations are passed. There will be a pressure on adequacy. So anyone receiving data from Europe will have to be even better armed with knowledge in order to basically deal with transfer mechanisms. There will be a generalization of data protection legislations. It's something which is going to happen, I believe, in all the big markets and the big countries. It's already happening. There will be more and more data best practice. There will be a lot of focus on privacy standards. There will be also the rise of something which is, not very well known yet, which is the privacy tech providers, basically offering technology to help you comply with privacy. And there will be obviously the rise of the clean rooms, which has a lot to do with, the acknowledgement that third-party cookies are disappearing. So basically, it's when, and you've got a lot of providers for that, but it's basically when two different parties can start exchanging and doing matching between first-party data sets in a very secure and in a privacy compliant way. So this is emerging everywhere. We can talk, obviously, at your convenience of data clean rooms. And in conclusion, and this is the true conclusion now, what should you do? We need to do something. Okay. That is pretty obvious because I can tell you my experience with the LGPD. The Brazilian industry was not ready when it happened, and it was a little bit of a rush. So getting ready and should start now. It's important to understand the timeline. It's important to look for alternatives to third-party cookies, but that's obvious. We all know that. Something which actually encapsulates the first 3 bullet points is really develop a data culture which is tied to a data privacy best practice. Very often when you've got a great data culture, it's a data processing and it's a targeting culture. It should always be mixed with privacy concerns, because what's the point of developing fantastic targeted segments if they're not compliant with the data protection legislation in place in the country where you operate? And the last point is, I would say, treat it as an opportunity to pull ahead of the competition. That's what we've been doing. And that's it for me.
Hi there.
Yes?
Hi, Vincent. It's Danny. How are you doing?
Hello, Danny. Very
Can you
good.
see me?
Not yet. Hold on, because I can just see my screen. Hey, here you are.
Hey, how are you? Just wanted to say thank you for the great explanation. Pretty clear. And thank you for always being there with us to help us navigate all the new coming regulation and making sure advertisers, marketers, and platforms can keep creating value through data in this privacy-first era. So I just wanted to say thank you for being here today with us.
And thank you for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.